present this work which we've done as part of this ERF project. These are some of the dated slides which were presented for a more technical seminar. So I'm going to skip through some of the more technical slides and focus on the big picture. And the big motivation for this project is really this book by Nicholas van der Wal that was written in Africa's context. It was called African Economies and the Politics of Permanent Crisis, in which he argued that many of the African states, when they were pushed to liberalize their economies, they did it in a highly selective manner. So certain sectors were liberalized or certain measures were liberalized, but in a highly selective way. And that selective liberalization is ultimately rooted in what Melanie Kemet says politics. It's the politics of partial liberalization. While Nicholas van der Wal's comments were really based on, and his analysis was based on a bunch of African cases and without using quantitative data. This is probably the first study that actually provides a quantitative assessment of this phenomenon, the politics of partial liberalization, focusing in particular on the decade of liberalization in Egypt during the decade of 2000s, essentially. And it's a story of the politics of trade protection, how one form of trade protection was simply replaced by another. So you have this massive tariff liberalization, which is compensated by the massive wave of non-tariff measures. And what this paper argues is that sectors that have had prior exposure to cronies, or politically connected actors, were the ones that disproportionately benefited from that wave of non-tariff measures. So here is a plot to motivate. You have, as you could see, the average tariffs since the late 1990s fell in Egypt. But while these average tariff barriers were decreasing, the non-tariff measures, so the share of imports covered by non-tariff measures, and I'll shortly define what we mean by non-tariff measures, increased dramatically. And more importantly, the standard deviation of this NTM coverage also increased, which means some sectors were more exposed to non-tariff measures than others. And we want to ask the question whether sectors that have had prior exposure to cronyism disproportionately benefited from this wave. What we want to ask is whether prior presence of politically connected actors in sectors, and we are going to work with a new database, the World Integrated Trade Systems database, which for the first time allows us to get a sense of which products are subjected to non-tariff measures and of what type. Which means which allows us building a panel data of sorts, and we could actually ask whether prior crony presence predicts the introduction of non-tariff measures, how many non-tariff measures were introduced in a particular sector, and of what type. Okay, so let us begin with first thinking about non-tariff measures. I mean, tariffs are taxes on imports and exports. Non-tariff measures have effects very similar to tariffs, but they are not ordinary customs tariffs. They actually have an economic effect on international trade in goods, whether by changing prices or quantities, and these are different kinds of procedural regulations. So here is a list of these different kinds of measures, and the UNCTAD typically divides these non-tariff measures into technical barriers and non-technical barriers. The technical measures are more like, they sound very innocuous, like sanitary and phytosanitary measures, technical barriers to trade. So this is really about conformity assessments, of whether or not you meet certain technical requirements, pre-shipment inspections. And then you have a bunch of all these measures like contingent trade protective measures. Suddenly you have huge trade flows from China. You could actually impose anti-dumping measures, price control measures, finance measures. Now, they all sound pretty innocuous, but actually many of these measures require discretionary enforcement, especially things like pre-shipment inspections or technical barriers, sanitary measures. Again, you need the state to ascertain that these requirements are met. And that's where deals become more important. These are kind of regulatory measures that are very opaque, that could be discretionary, and it could have very different consequences. So really, the devil is in the detail. Now, with the availability of this new database, the World Integrated Trade Systems database allows us for the first time to determine when NTMs are introduced, what types of these NTMs are, and if we match it with our database of political cronies, we could see sectors. So we have about 119 ISIC 4-digit sectors. We can then make an assessment of whether sectors that have had exposure to cronyism are receiving more non-tariff measures. Now, a bit of context, global context of non-tariff measures. Over time, we've seen that tariff-based protection has actually decreased considerably since the late 1990s. And in fact, the NTMs are now growingly dominating the landscape of trade protection. In fact, more than 70% of world trade protection today is in the form of NTMs. Now, of course, there's huge regional variation. Some countries rely more on NTMs than others, and this is a point I'll refer to right at the end of the presentation. But also that there's a lot of variation across sectors. Now, what our argument is really, I think this is a very interesting plot. This is from the electronics sector. And what this shows you is that there's a percentage of products covered by NTMs. It's an evolution since the late 1990s. And then we also have a measure of politically connected actors that varies over time, because we were able to get dates of foundation of many of these crony enterprises. So we can actually see when they are entering in that sectoral space. And what you would see in this plot is that actually as the percentage of products covered by NTM, the red line, as it evolves over time, it's preceded by the presence of cronies. So as cronies cumulatively increase in these sectors, there's more and more of their products are covered by NTMs. Now, of course, this is not true for all the sectors, but one of the things that we want to test is whether this prior crony presence predicts this evolution of non-tariff measures in those sectors. Now, here is a plot that again provides you some sense. So this is the new NTM introductions, the maximum introduction. So you have, let's say, a furniture sector, the second dot in the left panel. If there is no crony in that sector, 0. There's no NTM. But if there are cronies, then you would find there are about 5 NTMs on the right-hand side panel. Same for wearing apparel, food products. Again, it is subjected generally to high levels of NTMs, but if there are cronies in that sector, a lot more NTMs apply. So there's a bit of evidence that allows us to distinguish some of these things. Now, in order to explore this relationship with cronyism and non-tariff protection, we're actually drawing on a larger relationship between business and the trade, particularly in the political economy of trade. And in this global literature, much of this literature, at least in political science, has focused on aggregate cross-country differences. Very little within-country variation explored. And even within economics, much of the focus, whenever you have within-country studies, it's focused on OECD countries. So typically, people who explore this issue really look at the United States, Western Europe, and so on and so forth. And by and large, much of this work really focuses on tariff measures rather than non-tariff measures. So this is the first study that actually looks in the global context for a developing country, the endogeneity of trade policy with respect to non-tariff measures. Now, we also piggyback on a wave of studies that have looked at the impact of cronyism more generally on company performance, access. There's a lot of work that Isaac Divan and others, Bob Richkers, who's not around today, have done on cronyism. But much of this work is really looking at the firm side of things. Sectoral performance, employment generation, so on and so forth. And of course, this work also provides concrete evidence what Melanie just described as Stephen Hedman's work on networks of privilege. So we actually get a sense of what precise mechanisms these politically connected actors use to privilege their position. And of course, as I mentioned, this study provides an empirical illustration of what Nicholas van de Waal calls the partial reform syndrome, which is a much wider feature. It's not just a feature of the Middle East, it's a feature globally for developing countries. Now I'm going to skip through some of these slides on how we measure chronism. There's a lot more detail in our paper, but the basic ideas, again, are very much inspired by prior work done by Ishaq Diwan and others. So we take these lists of crony entrepreneurs from Rawl 2010 and then kind of divide into 3 different categories that allow us to determine who, politicians, associates, confidants, and we develop a broader measure of cronies, which includes all of these categories, and then a narrower version, which is more restrictive. But by and large, the results are pretty much robust to whether we use a broader or a narrower measure. Okay, so then this basically allows us to think about which sectors are crony sectors, so 0-1 dummy, whether or not there's a crony in there, and how many cronies. So both of these indicators will help us explore this. So as I said, the key novelty of this database is that it's a time-varying database. So whether or not a crony is present in a sector, how many of them, when are they entering, and how long have they been around. So all these information bits combined provide us a very powerful way of looking into how cronyism affects the politics of trade protection. Okay, so I'm going to skip through these, but here's a sectoral representation. About 44% of all sectors in our database are classified as crony sectors, and there is actually quite a bit of variation, ranging from 95% in motor vehicles to 59% in food products, tobacco, 80%, and there are many others like other transport equipment, 14%. So there's a lot of variation in terms of the exposure of these 4-digit sectors to crony activity. And we are going to exploit this variation across sectors to predict the impact of cronyism on trade protection. Now, when it comes to non-tariff measures, again, we are able to benefit from this WITS database, and we then define a number of variables. For instance, when is a binary dummy variable for whether or not an NTM is introduced in a particular sector and year, NTM presence, whether or not subjected to an NTM before, the NTM share, which is more of a continuous measure. It allows us to look at the share of products in a given sector that are covered by NTMs, or share of products subjected to at least 2 NTMs, or as you have seen in the UNCTAD classification, there are lots of different chapters. So another way to look at non-tariff protection is to look at the intensity of protection, and one proxy for that is the average number of chapters applied to a particular sector. Now, I'm not going to go through these results in a lot of detail, but just to give you a quick recap, a quick sense, brief flavor of what we've done. So we gradually build these models of NTM introduction in what economists and political scientists have worked on event history analysis, like analysis where you have the introduction of when there's a civil war, or when there is transition to democracy. There are a lot of 0-1 variables which kind of vary over time. So we use that framework to estimate conditional logistic models. These are basically logistic regression models that control for fixed effects. And the basic idea is, if a sector has had a prior presence of cronies, is it likely that an NTM would be introduced in the subsequent year? And that's the first row. That's what is demonstrating is you had a positive, highly significant impact of prior crony presence on the introduction of NTMs in the subsequent year. And this is controlling for a number of duration dependence variables. So if an NTM has been introduced before, how long has the time elapsed since the last introduction of the NTM, and so on and so forth. And the final column actually says, if a sector makes a first ever transition from crony to non-crony to crony, is it actually likely that there would be a first ever introduction of NTM? And again, you find a highly positive and significant impact. Just to put this size, the economic size of this impact, you find that if a sector is not populated by connected actors, the probability of an NTM introduction is about 50%. And If the sector has a presence of political cronies, the probability increases by 50% more. So it's about 0.75%. So quite a sizable impact. We then build our models and say, okay, this is a binary decision, right? It's about whether the presence of cronies leads to an introduction of NTMs. We next look at number of NTMs. So how many different number of NTMs are introduced if they are cronies? Because that captures the intensity of trade protection. And we built what economists usually describe as the Poisson models. And again, you find that if a sector is previously exposed to cronies, there's larger number of NTMs introduced in that sector. We then look at a more kind of continuous measure, which is not just whether or not an NTM is introduced, but actually what is the share of products in a sector that is covered by NTM. So if a sector has lots of different products, the higher is the share of the products within that sector that's covered by NTMs, it gives us a sense of the intensity of trade protection. And again, we find evidence taking into account, kind of persistence in non-tariff measures, a lot of other controls. We find that actually, if a sector has been previously exposed to politically connected actors, a greater share of products in that sector are covered by non-tariff measures. Now, that doesn't tell us a whole deal about causality. It tells us very much about how the two are co-evolving. And you could still say that there are certain sectors that are more predisposed to higher levels of non-tariff protection, or maybe there are underlying drivers of both non-tariff protection as well as the entry of these politically connected actors. So what we do here then is really use a kind of shock to the system, which was the EU-Egypt trade liberalization. And in this, we use the 2004 as a key moment, a watershed in Egyptian trade policy, because if you look at the evolution of trade policy, you see a lot of action since 1995, when Egypt becomes a member of WTO, trade liberalization gained momentum in late 1990s, and then Egypt starts signing a number of free trade agreements. But 2004 was a key moment in Egyptian trade policy, because firstly, quite a lot of qualified industrial zones that were set up with the US support really started becoming active around that time. But most importantly, this is the time when Egypt signs a major trade agreement with the European Union, harmonizes its implements a major program of harmonization of trade standards. And much of that period is important because in 2004, you have this trade agreement with the EU, and 6 months later, you have the Nazif cabinet, which consists of a lot of politically connected actors who can then use their position to benefit from the wave of non-tariff measures. And of course, Egypt is quite significant for this, because EU is quite significant for this event study, because EU is Egypt's largest trading partner, its main source of FDI, its principal bilateral donor, and so this massive kind of program of tariff liberalization carries huge significance for Egypt. So provides us a great shock to the system, because in a sense about 75% of the sectors in our sectoral space are affected by this trade liberalization. Importantly, a lot of this process of trade liberalization was externally driven. And you look at Al-Khoury's article from Carnegie Endowment, which talks about the post-9/11 environment in which the connection between trade policy initiatives and security strengthened as the US administration argued that global trade liberalization was a central plank of its national security and anti-terrorism efforts. And the EU followed suit as well. So quite a lot of these trade deals were being pushed from above, and given the nature of business-state relationship, it's still quite top-down. Now, cronies, again, could influence that process, but we argue, and our setup is going to be such that quite a lot of this was really driven by from above, and so we'll explain in a little while. Now, here is a crucial plot that we want to emphasize, because you have this in 2004, Egypt signs the EU trade treaty. And in 2005, there's a massive compensatory increase in non-tariff measures. So the 2004 Egypt agreement with the EU was mainly focused on tariff measures. That was the sole kind of domain in which trade liberalization took place. A year later, nearly 75% of the sectors were exposed to non-tariff measures. And we want to ask that this is a nearly universal shock to the system. Are sectors that were previously populated by cronies benefited more from this wave of NTM introductions? And we do know, and our measure allows us to look at these evolution of cronies over time, and we find that actually during this entire decade, there's a over time cumulative presence of politically connected actors in different sectors in Egypt is actually increasing. So at the same time when trade liberalization is taking place, cronies are dominating the landscape as well. So is there a possible connection? And of course, if you look at the entry of cronies, the massive wave was the 1996. These are old actors who were already there. And then you have different introductions in 2002, 2005, 2007, 2008. We treat all of those sectors in which these introductions take place as non-crony. We only focus on the predetermined measure, which is 6 years prior to the EU-Egypt trade treaty. Sectors that have had presence of politically connected actors, we only treat those sectors as crony sectors. So in a sense, we are tipping the scales against our results by excluding these subsequent waves of crony entry to make sure that it's just the predetermined component of crony entry that drives our results. And what we find, in order to conduct this analysis, we've got to make sure that the treated and the non-treated sectors are subjected to the same trends. So what this plot basically shows is this dashed line, which are the non-crony sectors. Now you could see that over time, they witnessed an increase in non-tariff measures. And they had very similar pre-trends. So prior to the introduction of the EU agreement, the evolution between crony and non-crony sectors when it comes to non-tariff measures is very similar. However, after 2004, you could see that the dashed line increases, but much less than the solid black line, which represents the crony sectors. So this provides us a first initial evidence of how this wave of crony entry, NTM introduction disproportionately benefited sectors that have had prior exposure to cronies. Now, this is a DID model which basically presents those results. It basically argues how sectors that were previously exposed to cronies after 2004 witnessed a greater cumulative increase in non-tariff measures. So the increase is about 35%. So many of these sectors that were previously populated by cronies witnessed a 35% increase in the share of non-tariff measures and about 28% increase in the new introductions of non-tariff measures. Now, this is a plot that really captures the story. So this provides us the coefficients that I was describing. This maps the time-varying impact of cronyism on the evolution of non-tariff protection. So these are estimates with their confidence intervals. And you could see prior to 2004, in our crony sectors, there was no relationship between cronyism and non-tariff protection. In fact, the confidence intervals are quite wide, and there could be a possibly negative impact. It is really after 2005, the first few years after 2005, that you really have an impact of cronyism on non-tariff protection. So it basically shows how sectors that were previously exposed to cronies, politically connected actors, are the ones that were the prime beneficiaries of this massive wave of non-tariff measures. Now, of course, we also look at a number of different measures. We control for a number of different NTM chapters, tariffs, imports, employees, and most importantly, we actually look at sector and time trends as well. So we already take into account the fact that certain sectors over time are more likely to witness a growing share of NTM measures. There's also quite a bit of stuff. We actually use some instrumentation, so even if there are remaining problems of endogeneity, can we use interesting instruments and combine them with our difference and different setup? These are econometric gimmicks that we use. So I'm just going to focus on some of the main results that come out of it. Now, all of this evidence, what does it mean? I mean, we are saying that there are these sectors that were politically connected in some form or the other, and they witnessed growing share of non-tariff measures. Why do these non-tariff measures matter for development? Now, firstly, it matters what types of NTMs we are talking about. So while there was a wave of non-tariff measures, the technical barriers to trade also witnessed a huge jump around 2005, right? So this is the share of products covered by TBT measures, the technical barriers to trade. And very soon I'm going to delve deeper into what these technical barriers to trade are. So while at the same time NTM protection is increasing, particular kind of protection is increasing, and that particular kind could be quite costly for many of these firms. Now, let us delve deeper into what these technical barriers to trade are. Here are 3 examples. So you have B, these are all B categories. So B140 is the authorization requirement. So importer must receive authorization, permits, approval from relevant government agencies. So an example would be imports must be authorized for drugs, waste and scrap, firearms, right? So these are all regulations, pretty innocuous and quite sensible, but they require government enforcement. And that's where there could be inconsistent enforcement, right? Some sectors could be subjected to a tougher inspection regime than others. Then you have similar inspection requirements, like textile and clothing imports must be inspected for size and materials. Then you have traceability of materials, so rules of origin kind of framework. All of this means, and I'm going to emphasize very soon, unconformity assessments, how different exporters and importers and manufacturers are conforming to different kinds of standardization. And to ascertain that they do conform with those requirements, you need government agencies, you need the enforcement regime, and that's where the government's role becomes increasingly important. Now, of course, we're talking about these 2 countries, for instance. Egypt, nearly 60% of the products were covered by at least 1 NTM. In Tunisia, it's even more. It applies on average 11 different NTMs from 2 different chapters on each of its more than 1,000 products. So you're talking about a lot of these hugely pervasive phenomena, and we know very little about these. Now, if you look at the distribution within Egypt of these technical barriers to trade, it is really the B84, B859, B89 that are important. And what are these tall bars? These are conformity assessment requirements. And again, as I mentioned, conformity assessments are the kinds of barriers that would kick in the discretionary state enforcement regime, and therefore could be quite harmful. Now, there is now beginning to be more evidence on what non-NTMs contribute. And I looked at a recent study from the International Trade Center in Geneva that conducted surveys in 4 Arab economies, including Tunisia and Egypt. And they found company perspectives on non-tariff measures. And they argued that actually more than half of NTMs firms believed were dominated by SPS, the sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and the technical barriers to trade. And in fact, there's also quite a lot of dependence on price control measures and contingent trade protection. So in Morocco, for instance, price control measures are far more important than technical barriers to trade. So there's variation in the types of NTMs that are heavily relied upon. Contingent trade protection, which is, emergency anti-dumping measures, again, are quite rife in the region. And as I mentioned, the measures of conformity assessment and rules of origin are perceived particularly difficult to deal with, and these are firm responses. But very importantly, firms argued that NTMs are more burdensome when they are combined with procedural obstacles. So NTMs on their own may not be the full problem. The full problem really appears when you have to combine NTMs with a lot of procedural obstacles in terms of conformity assessments, this inspections regime that comes with it. But a very important insight of these company perspectives is that non-tariff measures are actually a major barrier to intra-regional trade. So a lot of the Arab firms express that these are key barriers when it comes to regional trade. And this is very important, again, going back to Melanie's point about how the region compares with East Asia. We should remember, and I'm going to speak more about that tomorrow in the final session, that actually in East Asia, there's far less reliance on non-tariff measures, firstly. Secondly, in the East Asian case, you had both the guiding hand of the state and the disciplining hand of the state. The state guided which sectors they should enter. But there would also a disciplining hand. And the disciplining hand was really through competition in international trade and regional trade circuits. That made sure that these cronies, even if they were deriving huge privileges, were ultimately susceptible to competition, growing competition outside. That's where these trade barriers are particularly problematic in the Middle East, because they take away that pre-commitment mechanism that would combine the guiding hand with the disciplining hand of the state. But that's a discussion for tomorrow. Now, there's some work that we are doing as a result of this project, and one of the great things about these intellectual projects is that you get support for one project, but it creates the database to be able to do a lot more things. And so I'm going to provide you a few segments from some of the work we are doing beyond Egypt and non-tariff measures. So look at Tunisia, for instance. Again, you find that sectors that have had presence of Ben Ali firms, as more and more cronies are present in that sector, there's a higher predicted probability of a non-tariff measure being introduced. So we're still doing very similar kind of work on Tunisia, but these are some of the initial patterns. In the metal and construction sector, for instance, again, technical barriers are hugely important. So the red bars are the level of these barriers in connected sectors. So you could see that the technical barriers to trade more than double in the metal and construction sector in the connected sectors as opposed to the unconnected. And of course, another dimension of partial liberalization.
You have 5 minutes.
Sure, I'll be done in 5 minutes. Another dimension of partial liberalization has to do with the tariff liberalization. So far I've talked about how tariffs were liberalized and they were compensated by non-tariff measures. But another powerful story, complementary to what I've been talking about, is how tariffs liberalized more in subsectors as opposed to others. And Egypt is a classic example. So if you look at this blue bar, it's the percentage change in mean tariffs. You could see that cumulatively, mean tariffs fell remarkably. But the standard deviation of these tariffs increased, which means some sectors were more liberalized than others. And in Tunisia, although both ratios decreased, the dispersion decreased far less than the decline in tariffs. And that's another part of this story of politics of partial liberalization. And of course, to sum up, why does all of this matter? It matters because we are talking about trade policy. We are talking about the manner in which political connections are used to derive preferential tariff and non-tariff protection. But we're actually talking about selective trade liberalization and the manner in which it is used to tie an emergent and resourceful economic elite to the regime. And these selective privileges obviously are likely to persist. And we've seen that in Egypt there's been a wave of tariff increases as well. And many of the cronies are still around. The non-tariff measures are pretty sticky. So it makes for an interesting story of the way in which it's still a moving picture story when it comes to the politics of trade protection. But more importantly, I want to emphasize the importance of how rents derived from trade policy are extremely important for thinking about the nature of the political order. Because way back in time, in 1970s and 80s, there was a wave of literature that argued that rents are harmful for development, and particularly those that are linked with intervention in the economy. So it was all about how a hugely interventionist state creates rents that are harmful for development. But what this story tells you is that actually regimes can create rents in the process of liberalization, and mainly through selectively liberalizing, protecting some sectors, liberalizing others. And these rents are important for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons they are very important has to do with what North calls how these rents are used to tie the elite together as a kind of a binding commitment for many of these elites. And of course, they're important also for the region, because one of the most fascinating plots that I've found over time is this plot from the World Bank report that talks about tariffs and non-tariff measures. And the darker bars are the non-tariff measures, the barriers. These are tariff equivalents. And the lighter gray bar is our tariffs. And what is so surprising, there are two big facts from this plot. The first is the Middle East and North Africa has the most pervasive non-tariff barriers in the developing world. It leaves even sub-Saharan Africa behind when you look at these tariff equivalents. If you look at the dark bar in MENA, it's huge. That's the first part of the story. The second part of the story is that actually these non-tariff measures are more pervasive in labor-abundant economies of the region. And I think some of the evidence that we are compiling suggests why that might be so. It is because many of these countries that have far less oil and hydrocarbon resources to rely on need to create additional rents from government manipulation of the economy, because these rents are in turn therefore distributed to key members of the elite in order to to ensure regime stability. That's one possible explanation. But anyway, the big point of the paper is that the devil is in the detail, and I really want to thank the ERF for allowing me to collect this data, to look at these relationships, and I think it could provide us a more informed platform to think about the effect of political connections on trade policy. Thank you.